I'm Tom Rassieur, the John E. Andrus III Curator of Prints and Drawings, and I welcome you to MIA today for our panel discussion on modern art and politics in Germany, 1910 to 1945. This whole program is the brainchild of my colleague Virajta Singh, who is right over there. Raise your hand a little higher. Yay, Virajta. Virajta is our head of DEI, and she has wonderful contacts throughout the community and really likes to bring MIA into close contact and into partnership with many of our collegial institutions around town. And so thank you very much for reaching out to the University of Minnesota in this case. We have with us three professors from the University of Minnesota from, now let's see, maybe I can even advance that. Thank you. Priyanka Basu comes to us from the University of Minnesota at Morris. She earned her PhD at the University of Southern California. She's an associate professor, and she works on modern and contemporary art and has a particular interest in the history of art history in Germany. These are going to be very brief introductions because we have a lot today. Katerina Korola received her PhD at the University of Chicago. She's an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota in film and media. She's interested, she's very interested in these topics, and she's been a great participant in the preparation for this. And we have to take special advantage of our time with Katerina today because in about 2 weeks she's moving out to Berkeley, California, where she's going to be a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Terrific. How about some applause for that one, huh? She got sick and tired of these Minnesota summers. Matthias Rothe received his PhD at the University of Frankfurt-Oder. Now, this is not the Frankfurt that you know in Western Germany. This is the Frankfurt in the east, over near the Polish border, which is a very international school. And Matthias is a full professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where he works in German studies and philosophy. So you can see we have a lot of intellectual firepower here today, and I'm going to be hoping I'll be just prompting them a little bit and let them carry the ball because they are so good. The exhibition has a subtitle, Masterworks from the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin. This is a picture of their incredible Mies van der Rohe pavilion, a very hard museum for a curator to work in because, as you can see, there are no walls. So there's no place to put the art. But they have a wonderful collection, and we are so fortunate that it comes to us here in Minneapolis. The exhibition deals with a very, very turbulent time in German history. It starts in 1910 when we still have the Empire and Kaiser Wilhelm II ruling the roost, which brings us into World War I. And at the end of the war, there is a revolution, which is started by a revolt among sailors who realize that they're going to lose and they don't want to be sent off on suicide missions. And so they say, no, we're not going. And eventually that attitude pervades the country. Kaiser Wilhelm falls, Germany falls, and they start over from scratch and have to figure out how to govern themselves. And they establish the Weimar Republic, a vibrant democratic institution which was full of people with extreme ideas because they were in extreme conditions with the Treaty of Versailles, which had really brought Germany to its knees. So you had people on the left who were interested in communism and people on the right who were interested in that stripe of politics, which led directly to Adolf Hitler and the rise of Nazism. That brings us into World War II and the Holocaust and the expansion of the German borders, and then again a fall with the German defeat in World War II and having to start all over again. So you can imagine trying to live through that time to create art and try to cope with everything that's going on. So that brings us to some of the questions for today. These are just broad questions that make us think a little bit about when does art become political And how did artists respond to tradition, nationalism, crisis, democracy, dictatorship, and disaster? And with that, I'm going to sit down and join our colleagues for a little conversation. But first, I will pump the book. I am not the author of this book or this exhibition. I am the presenting curator. That means I'm here to massage the show for the Minneapolis audience. And so I can unreservedly recommend this catalog that was put together by my colleagues at the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin and at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth. I know that you are the type of people who are very interested in learning deeply, and this is a good place to do that. So with that, I will sit down with our guests. Hi, welcome to you. I think that what we want to do is go ahead and throw open the question, the very basic question of when does art become political? And Matthias, would you like to start us off?
I can try. It's a big question. Art is not, I mean, I would say, and you see this in the exhibition, that there is not only a politics defined by content, what is depicted, but there is something that I would call a politics of form, and especially the art and the period we are talking about, for example, the beginning of the 20th century, there was a move of artists in groups like the Blue Rider or the Bridge against everything that was tradition, and there was a lot of tradition. It was a time of restoration, and so the breaking of traditional forms was symbolically charged with expression of liberty or with authenticity, and so there again, the politics is a politics of form, but I would say even if artists do not have the intention to be overtly political, as soon as they attempted to say something about their present, it was clear that the traditional forms, I mean, I'm a scholar of theater, and the traditional forms of theater didn't work anymore. Bertolt Brecht, for example, struggled with a play on financial speculation, and it was entirely clear to him at one point it's not possible to write a 5-act drama with a tragic hero if you want to talk about financial speculation. You have to do something completely different. It's a structural problem. It's something that cannot be captured in these traditional forms. So if they wanted to talk about the present, and talking about the present already was a political move, then this had to destroy the form. Even if artists did not want to be political, they had to be. It was a request of the material in a way. So this is what I would answer very briefly.
Before we go on, in a sec, I'm happy for you. I want you to chime in, but this is the type of difference that we're talking about in, This is the type of difference that we're talking about when we talk about changes in form. So here's Kaiser Wilhelm, and he wanted art to look like it was warmed over Baroque. And so we see that there's a sharp break with what had come before.
I'll just chime in going off that, but I think thinking about this exhibition, one of the strengths of the exhibition is it really gives a wide model for thinking about art and politics, the relationship between aesthetic form and political ideas, also political action. This is a moment when we're thinking about the 1910s, the period of World War I, the immediate aftermath. This is a moment where being a modern artist really becomes associated with being revolutionary in some way. And the question is, how is that revolution defined? How does form relate to the way the artists were living, relate to what they hoped their artwork would communicate? And even within expressionism, there's an extreme variety here. We see Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, a Dresden and later Berlin-based artist associated with Die Brücke, versus Franz Marc, associated with the Munich-based expressionist group Der Blaue Reiter. And these are both two artists who very much saw themselves as revolutionaries, both formally and spiritually, but had completely divergent politics, as well as even just styles of painting. We can note Kirchner himself was extremely interested in primitive art, especially indigenous art objects that were collected by the German Empire. And he saw in this art, in a way that should rightly become under some scrutiny today, but he saw an alternative to a kind of conventional European bourgeois lifestyle that he himself, as an artist and a bohemian, really wanted to embrace. And we can see him here in a self-portrait with the girl. The model is Erna Schilling, who is his model, later unofficial wife, and a painter in her own right, as well as textile designer. And he's really modeled them here after these primitive or these indigenous masks that he was seeing in ethnographic collections. Versus Franz Marc, who was much more interested in thinking about the way color, line, and form could really open up new ways of seeing, and also very interested in natural themes. And looking at these works, you might be surprised to know that Ernst Ludwig Kirchner was a very committed pacifist. He ended up enlisting as a medic in World War I to avoid conscription into the infantry, and suffered a nervous breakdown almost immediately, at which point he was able to go to Switzerland. Whereas Franz Marc was extremely enthusiastic about World War I as an opportunity to again, break out of this kind of stultifying, unsatisfying bourgeois existence through a violent transformation. So this painter of these beautiful, peaceful, harmonious horses was actually an extremely enthusiastic supporter of Germany's entry into the war. And I think the combination of these works really just goes to show how complex this relationship between politics and form is across the exhibition.
And of course, both paid a heavy price for their participation in the war, with Kirchner's nervous breakdown and Franz Marc dying at the Battle of the Somme. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just go back to the broader question before addressing the works, but I would just say that all art is political. It can sort of legitimate power or destabilize it, and everything in between. And I think it's more beyond just looking for very deliberately political works with political messages, of which there are a lot in the show. We can always think about the politics of any art by just looking at it very concretely, and how it's produced, how it's received in its situation. And we can also look at the politics of supposedly apolitical art, like I think the expressionists could fairly be called apolitical, but there's there's an element of protest to their focus on form, as I think you have pointed out. And and all of the art in this exhibition, I think, is very differently political. There's, and especially when we get to Neue Nationalgalerie, it really goes across the political spectrum, the allegiances of the artists, or sort of where they ended up, how they ended up being received. But we can think about all of their politics in really complex ways. It's usually not just affirmative or regressive. It's usually something, some complicated mixture of things.
And there's also the whole point, the whole issue of being politicized, which of course is a through line in the exhibition, with, especially with, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm has very strong opinions about what should be in German museums, and then Hitler has even stronger opinions about that. And of course, we wind up with the firing of many of these artists from their teaching positions in 1933, and then being declared degenerate in 1937 and having their works confiscated and humiliated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did anyone want to talk about politicization at all? No? Go on.
No, we can definitely talk about it. I wanted to add to to what Priyanka said about every art is political and in different ways, that maybe one tendency that can be pointed out between these works that were pre-World War I and the works that were after World War I is that art became, in these early phases, at the breaking of form, the breaking of tradition was, as I said, symbolically charged with ideas of authenticity, spirituality, freedom against alienation, and it became much more overtly and concretely political after World War I for obvious reasons. And you can see this, for example, with a new artist organization that is represented here too, the so-called November Gruppe. I mean, these groups of artists were more or less united by style, but the November Gruppe, they called themselves November Gruppe after the revolution in November, and they were not united by style anymore. You had futurists, Dadaists, expressionists, you had then filmmakers, you had writers, composers, architects, and their commitment, what brought them together, was a commitment for a kind of revolution and for a different form of republic. And these artworks, and that we had before, came into existence under the very suffocating conditions of the Wilhelmine Empire. So there is a change of politics that is very obvious with World War I as being a kind of very central factor in there.
And if I can jump in, an artist like George Grosz, who later becomes associated with the Dada movement, actually started his career working in a more expressionist mode and ended up creating very explicitly political art in the context of the First World War as a mode of protest that he then carried across his work in the 1920s as well. And he's represented by 2 paintings in the exhibition, one of which we'll see later on.
Yeah, and I can just add that, speaking of these works up here, I think it was already mentioned that Kirchner made this work sort of after the war started. He was served briefly, but was, had a breakdown, was very traumatized, and, spent the rest of his life really recovering from that. But so there's a shift already in this work from like the more exuberant work of early De Bruyke in like the sort of the harsh colors and the way he and his partner look very sort of hollowed out, and there's not this kind of exuberant kind of brushwork, but he expresses his politics by dramatizing his his own experience and his own feelings, and that was a very expressionist mode, right? Of instead of later artists who really try to show like the collective experience of war, or who try to focus on the politicians who profited from the war and started the war. For someone like Kirchner, it's very much about, kind of dramatizing his own nervous breakdown in his art. And he paints many portraits sort of along these lines.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You all started to talk about the post-war period and Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity. And Matthias especially asked me to include this pairing here. And do you care to address that?
I wanted to have these juxtaposed to see that that the movement of new objectivity, it was called differently in the US, was a kind of broader movement. So you found these artistic tendencies in Germany, other European countries, and definitely also in the US. And sometimes some art scholars call this a turn towards a conservative modernity, because there's a return to realism, obviously. But as you can also see here, that this return to realism cannot undo what has been done before, and does not want to undo it. The kind of dissolution of form is inscribed here in a certain way. You see that this the geometrical construction, you see moments of cubism in this realism, and what you also have here is a certain, at least we, in retrospect, I would say, are inclined to see an ambivalence in these paintings, that that bring modern industry and technology together with landscape motives. Artists at the time might have even endorsed this, but there is an eerie feeling to this. There's an ambivalence, and I would say even to a beholder at the time. And this is something I think that this so-called conservative modernism, and I stick with this term, in retrospect is sometimes, to me at least, much more interesting than these very overtly political images that are very timely and that also lose their relevance because they are so related to events at the time. And here we get to something that stays on in its ambivalence and in its eeriness. And I wanted to pair these, as I said, because I wanted to show it was not just a German phenomenon. Schiller's image of the Ford plant, commissioned at the time, was painted almost at the same time as Schrimpf's railway crossing. And interesting is really this kind of, for me, this combination between a kind of the classical landscape, this is the name of the painting also, even the sunrise, the kind of idyllic light and the deserted scenery that we see, and a beholder, it's hard to find a vanishing point. Our gaze is drawn out by these railways, out of the picture, as if we are not even invited to dwell there. And these change meaning, of course, today. But I would say even at the time, I don't know what you think, they had this eerie ring.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely in this slide, Tom, you called it a change in tone, and I think a lot of it is the tone as well, this rejection of the kind of excessive emotionality, the exuberance, the ecstasis of a kind of expressionist mode, and a turn to a more kind of alienated mode of depiction where the artist pulls their own subjectivity back, but is also, these are works that are really thinking about, like, what does it mean to have a relationship to this changing landscape, to, let's just take the shrimp. What does it mean to have an aesthetic relationship to a railway and a railway crossing? How can one forge that relationship? And it's a painting that really doesn't offer much guidance. It forces the viewer to kind of confront their own alienation from the world around them. And this is also a moment, too, where there's an extreme skepticism in appearances. This is the moment of so-called stabilization to then the market crash. So the sense that appearances, the kind of glamour of modernity is more deceptive than one thinks. And it kind of puts the way these paintings sometimes put realism under pressure, and we think realism here, but are we just looking at like a stage set, is really also asking you to think about that uncertainty of the modern world.
The shrimp painting is not in the exhibition. There is a shrimp painting there that is similarly empty in terms of being peopled, and similarly it shows elements of nature more in the painting upstairs, and with very prominent presence of technology with a radio tower in it, and so that's what you're seeing there is an alienation from this modernity, or just a questioning of it.
I think it's really open for interpretation. In both cases, you could say, is this a kind of metabolization of technological modernity into a more traditional genre format, the landscape? Does the radio tower or is it a electrical pole, whatever it is, does that serve the function of a tree?
Compositionally.
Or does it fundamentally change the category of landscape?
Yeah.
And I think the paintings, both this work, the Schiller and the one upstairs, really leave that question open.
Okay.
Can I add?
Please.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to briefly add to this, that this is something for me that deeply marks a lot of the artistic expressions in the 1920s. There is and a little beyond, there is a deep ambivalence, and ambivalence meaning it is left open in which direction things might go. There is a famous essay by Siegfried Krakauer called The Mass Ornament, where he describes a tourney by the Tiller Girls, by the American Tiller Girls, and he describes their movements on stage and the whole choreography as something that is deeply liberated from oral tradition, from a lot of conventions, but at the same time it can very easily become a disciplinary nightmare. So for him it is suspended in this suspended between liberation and the entire opposite. And I think this is something one can identify in a lot of artistic expressions at the time, this open question.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to step back for this section and just underline that how crippled and devastated Germany was by the war, its economy. There was political violence throughout the Weimar Republic. There was extreme political polarization and extreme inflation. So the curator, Gustav Hartlaub, who curated the first kind of large exhibition of this kind of work, which was called New Objectivity or Neue Sachlichkeit, talked about how this kind of more critical, this more realistic and precise mode was needed to really deal with extreme chaos and catastrophe. So it was a form of bringing sort of some kind of control to the environment. And just in terms of art and politics, interestingly, he sort of classified New Objectivity artists as sort of left-wing and classicizing. And he didn't, want to map this onto their politics exactly, but he talked about how there were some artists, who we'll see soon, whose works were really sort of biting and like very much about the present and almost like caricatures, and whereas some artists were like Schrimpf, sort of classicizing, and their works were more sort of uncanny. Neue Sachlichkeit was also called magic realism, and I think that describes the mood of Schrimpf's works well, where it's hard to pin things down, and it seems suspended, like we sort of keep saying, right, between technology and nature, between past and present, and even though Schrimpf was personally a politically left artist, he adopted this kind of classicizing mode.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, I'll preface this. My native German-speaking colleague, Andreas Marx, our curator of Japanese art, hears Neue Sachlichkeit translated as New Objectivity and goes, no, bad translation. It should be something more like New Thinginess. And my response is nobody gets their PhD studying New Thinginess. But what do you does the translation matter, mean anything to you in that respect? Does the translation cause us to misunderstand what was originally meant by that classification?
I think it's a fine enough translation, but as with any translation, and this is why also, there's the tendency to just use the German, and I think it's always better to provide both, because Sachlichkeit, it can mean objectivity, but it also means a lot of other things.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of polysemy to the original word. Thinginess is one. Another kind of useful point of reference for audiences is to know that the term sachlich in German today, if you go to a bookstore and you look for sachliche Bücher, that those would be usually like nonfiction books. So it has a sense of like actuality, a factuality, could be objectivity. Another important meaning is this sense of sobriety. Sometimes it's translated as the new sobriety, and that refers more to this mood or this withdrawn tone, this repression of the observer's emotional response to the object depicted, and this kind of scientism as well.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I mean, thinking about the different, meanings of the word, I think that sort of helps us understand, like, these different types of work that we see, like, I think Otto Dix said he wanted to, get close to the object. Some artists thought of it more as making an art that was more legible for the masses and not elitist, like Expressionism. So there were a whole range of ways they were sort of thinking about it.
And an important aspect is what you've said earlier, that the subjectivity of the artist is kind of withdrawn. I mean, not a lot of, but significant numbers of these artists of Neue Sachlichkeit worked with photography. Charles Schiller does not really belong to Neue Sachlichkeit, but is very close to them, for example, worked a lot with photography. So they, if in the context of Expressionism, which was all about expression, as the term says, this kind of withdrawing of the artistic subjectivity is an important aspect of, and objectivity in that context works. I mean, I think.
Yeah, and that was sometimes, perceived, and I think a lot of these works can be perceived as kind of cynical. It was also, that was a term to describe it, and they can be so detached that you really can't pin down the artist. Like, the artist doesn't want to, want to pin down exactly where they stand. Yeah.
My second question, when I look at the Kurt Kverner self-portrait, I often think of its similarity to 15th and 16th century Northern portraiture, where the sitters are holding emblematic flowers and whatnot. After the First World War, the government is set up briefly in Weimar, at least it's established there. And Weimar is chosen partly because it's an old seat of learning, and it's associated with German classicism and whatnot. And so I sometimes wonder if the Neue Sachlichkeit artists are actually thinking about what it means to be German. What should the German identity be? And something that is rooted in their traditions, or something that's distinct from what's going on in other places. Do you think that has any validity?
Yeah. I mean, for example, if we go back to Schrimpf, I think that there was a debate in Weimar Germany about whether Germany was like truly like an industrial nation, or whether it was connected to nature, whether it was an agricultural nation. So I think that I think those debates are taking place about what is German, and I think that. I think that the return to old master painting is really in a really important frame for these works as well. So there was one particular book by Max Stirner that was very popular. It was a book, that sort of spelled out how German Renaissance and Italian Renaissance artists, carried out all the processes of their art, and artists across the political spectrum studied it. So it's very, surprising, but even someone like George Gross or someone like Otto Dix is kind of learning, or a leftist artist like Kerner, who is a very committed artist. They're looking at traditional, kind of processes of making art as a way to sort of think about the present.
In that sense, the idea of moving against the tradition has to be relativized, because it is a certain 19th century classicism tradition against a lot of these artists' move. I associate this kind of relation to a German heritage also with the Expressionists. I mean, they wanted to go back to Dürer, Grünbein, and others, so and kind of reconfigure the kind of gesture for modern times. So, and this was an explicit reference to German heritage with the early Expressionists already.
Yeah, and I mean, in that sense, the old masters might be a little more international or a little more ambivalent. I think the Italian Renaissance portrait is also a really important reference as well. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily German, though. I think another element of what you've brought up, which is, I think, so crucial to this period, is also this sense of mastery or authority. And this is also one of the reasons New Objectivity painters have been critiqued as a kind of, or the style of new objectivity has been framed as a conservative impulse, as this return to traditions of learning, traditions of techniques, this kind of storehouse of artistic education that some of these painters possessed, but not all painters would have possessed, and that the expressionists had made a show of throwing off. So that's another important element, I think, to keep in mind when thinking about this engagement with the Renaissance portrait.
Thanks. Katerina, would you like to continue? You especially asked me to include the Dick's portrait of Flechtime. I wonder if you'd like to address that.
Well, I had asked you to include these together because I think these two portraits give a real sense of the ambivalence of new objectivity in a different way. Dick's is certainly, for many people, considered one of the master painters of this movement, and is somebody who's extremely politically ambivalent. He's, by Hartlaub, I think, framed as a Verist or part of the left-leaning wing of the Neue Sachlichkeit movement that's really using painting as a mode of social critique. And some of his earliest post-war works looked specifically at war veterans, at prostitutes as well, and early criticism of his work really pointed to his fine-grained but merciless observations. By the mid-1920s, he starts doing more society portraits, and the style of kind of almost cruel, cynical observation becomes quite fashionable. And this is a very interesting painting that he did of the art dealer Alfred Flechtime, who was a very important tastemaker in Weimar Germany, really responsible for buoying the careers of many artists of the new objectivity movement as well as the expressionist movement, and German Jewish heritage as well. And it's a very controversial painting because we can see here Dix apply this merciless observation to the dealer, criticism at the time. And if you're in the galleries, I really encourage you to go up close and look at the painting in detail. But critics of the time talked about the finely articulated hair follicles. And that just really goes to show what critics were noticing. But it also here leans into caricature in a way that certainly after the 1930s becomes extremely troubling. And Dix did not want this painting exhibited later on because of its articulation of what were at the time already anti-Semitic caricatures, but which became much more dangerous in a post-1933 moment. So it's a painting that's filled with ambivalence. Whereas with the counter, we can see this kind of similar sense of this like extreme observation. And for me, the nettle is so symbolic, but what I'm really struck by is the redness on his cheek and his nose. This was a painting commemorating the painter. The painter painted it after returning from a protest where he was beaten by the police. So we can see the very different ways that this extreme observation, this attention to the kinds of details that in a kind of traditional mode of portraiture would have been massaged away by the artist, is here used for very different effect.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that you often see in sort of following from that in new objectivity portraiture is what people have called typecasting. You know, the art historian Maria Michaela calls it typecasting because even though it's a realism, often what you see are social types, and she talks about how this is another way that artists tried to impose order on a very chaotic time. And so artists across the political spectrum are making portraits that today seem, incredibly harsh and unflattering and often very misogynistic. There are many unflattering portraits of modern women. And so, this is just another way that new objectivity can be very sort of cynical in its kind of precision.
That's great, and I think we're going to get back to that in a few minutes with some slides we've got, and I think we'll move ahead to an artist that you all have mentioned, George Grosz, and here we see him in conjunction with Kandinsky. These couldn't be further apart, but did anybody care to address either of these paintings? I guess not.
Well, I guess I could just say that, looking at Kandinsky brings in another kind of major current in Weimar art. Kandinsky at this time, after being the leader of Blue Rider, was now an instructor or a master at the Bauhaus School of Art and Design, which is intersects with the show in many ways. There's, many instructors at the Bauhaus who are included in the show, and it existed during exactly the lifetime of the Weimar Republic.
Yes.
And so we see a shift in his work that sort of parallels what happens during the Bauhaus, which is, early on it's more expressionist oriented, and then soon, under political pressure, the director Walter Gropius sort of worries that, about the school being thought of as too bohemian and too radical, and it kind of changes towards a more functionalist mode. But Kandinsky also sort of moderated his work to be more kind of geometric and diagrammatic, and kind of spoke about it in a more kind of scientific sort of language than he had, and instead of a spiritual one. And so I think you see some of that here.
What you said about the Bauhaus professors being well represented in the show, I think in the room devoted to modes of abstraction, I think of it as Walter Gropius's dream team. I mean, it's just amazing how many of the artists in there were chosen as his first faculty. Sorry, did you? Either of you?
Yeah, this is one of Grosz', I think, most famous pieces. Pillars of Society is also a reference to a play by Henrik Ibsen, but it means, of course, those people that it's a depiction of the so-called elite of Weimar as Grosz sees it. The person in front has a swastika, so he is a Nazi member. Some scholars interpret him as being a judge, and others talk about former student fraternity, but somewhere between that, and you see a journalist behind him with a feather, or also a palm leaf that is full of blood, and somebody who has a little sign saying socialism is work, perhaps an SPD member, and you see a priest and someone who is between a front soldier and a paramilitary. So you have the church, the politics, so all these pillars of society, and the common theme is war here, as you see when the person in front, let's call him the judge, that a horse and a rider come out of his head, the blood on the feather, the priest is kind of blessing the troops, and there's a sword in the front, and there's a soldier in the back. So people are up for a new war, they are dreaming of the old war. You can read it in these different ways. For me, what's kind of striking in this picture is that Grosz made it in 1926, and 1926 was a time when the Nazi Party didn't yet play a big role, and it was one of the few years of stability in Weimar. Between 24 and 29, the world economic crisis, these were some years of stability. So he painted it then, and it seems to anticipate kind of the end of the Republic and the rise of the Nazi Party. But what it also shows with his depiction of possibly an SPD politician here is how unloved the Weimar Republic was by people across the board. There were very little defenders of this democratic experiment. From the left to the right, people were against it and thought of something new that needs to come. So, and this is for me also a subtext of this Grouche painting.
If I can jump in just to add to, I mean, I think one of the wonderful things about this painting is just how sharp an observer Grouche is to have picked up on this, but also to have encoded this in the image. You mentioned the palm leaf, but this obvious signifier of this kind of attempt to kind of stir a new push to rebuild Germany's colonial empire that's being indicated by this slight detail or the scar on the cheek of the gentleman in the front, which indicates this kind of his membership of an elite fraternity. So this kind of association with the old aristocracy as well. So there's all of these encoded symbols, even the charging horse that we see, that's almost like a blue rider figure that's coming from his head, and it's a kind of critique of expressionism as well. So it just shows this like extremely sharp sense of observation.
Yeah, I will confess, this is my favorite object in the show. I just love this thing. It's so intense. And on the lapel of the foreground figure with holding the beer stein and the sword, you also see a ribbon, and that's an indication that he won the Iron Cross second class in the First World War. And so we have this war horse coming out of his head. He wants to relitigate the whole thing. And the newspaper man, is actually, I'm sorry I can't come up with his name right now, but he was, pardon me? Hugenberg, who he actually was the top executive at the Krupp Ironworks, which were providing the arms for the military during World War I. And afterwards, he created a newspaper empire of very conservative newspapers, and you can see the blood is flowing down there. And of course, what he's wearing on his head is not a helmet; it's a chamber pot, because that's what Grouche would like to do to him. And of course, the shall I say it, shit-headed politician is holding a flag, which it's not the colors of the Weimar Republic, that's the colors of the empire. And so he wants to go back to the old way with the fat cats in charge, and the little brochure, the Sozialismus ist Arbeit, Socialism is Work, was actually a pamphlet that was printed in the millions and distributed to try and quell worker unrest, to tell them to go back to work and be quiet and be productive. So there really is a lot encoded in this thing. It's just a stunning piece. And if they open the cases back in Germany after the show and this is missing, well, you'll know where to find it.
To hang this in your living room? Is this what you're...
Chi, what do you think? I got you on the spot. Oh, in the bedroom. Okay, great.
Even better.
Wow. Things are getting exciting. You all brought up modern life and gender and technology is another big theme, and perhaps somebody would like to address technology, or should we go on? Actually, you know what? We're getting pretty late in the program, so why don't I just go to the gender images and let's start there. Did anybody have any observations about the differences in the way the women are depicted here?
Well, going back to something Priyanka had said earlier, I mean, I think the show really does a good job of also showing us how the figure of the woman, and especially the so-called new woman or the Neue Frau, really becomes an allegory for modernity in this period, a figure upon which critiques of modernity are projected, but that also indicates a sense of possibility and affiliation. And Sonia by Christian Schad, which serves as the exhibition's primary iconography, I think is it's a really excellent choice, and it's an excellent demonstration of this new woman, which we should also understand as a kind of media phenomenon as well, and a kind of myth as much as a reality, characterized by her independence, economic, social, sexual, experimenting with new modes of style. I think here you've really set up a great kind of transition from Kokoschka's Bessie Bruce from 1910, this kind of still quite modern society woman, but still wearing a kind of relatively traditional dress. Her hair is up, but it's long hair that's been kind of crimped and arranged laboriously, to someone like Sonia, who has embraced a much more radically androgynous look, the short hair called the Bubikopf, or the boys' hairstyle in the period, and this kind of new sleek silhouette that emphasizes an almost boyish figure. And she's proudly smoking a cigarette, something you see in many paintings of the new woman, signaling her rejection of the kind of gendered conventions of self-presentation, but also a kind of sensuality that might also be a source of anxiety. And that's also a question here is, what does it mean to paint the new woman like this? The way she's kind of crossed her legs and is grasping her knees. What do we make of that? Is that an invitation? Is that Schad sexualizing her? There's a lot of questions in the depiction as well.
And it's a package of camel cigarettes. I mean, it kind of reflects the kind of big hype for the US and the American modernity in the 1920s, at least until the world financial crisis. Yeah.
And also her cosmetics sitting there in plain view. And this is behavior that would have been outrageous 10 years earlier. And so this really is the jazz age, and Schad showing a very new mode of being for women. But I'm very interested in what you said about perhaps it being more of a fiction than it really was, than an actuality. You were talking about it might not really have been this way as frequently as we might think.
Well, I think, simultaneously it was both a fiction and a reality. And, from the beginning, the new woman in the context of Weimar periodicals is promoted in fashion plates, on the covers of magazines, as a kind of symbol of this new reborn German society. So she's simultaneously an index of real material transformations in women's social possibilities, we could say, as well as a fiction, and even a kind of consumerist fiction, and an attempt to appeal to these new women as new consumers that could be sold clothes or patterns.
Just as few of us look like the covers of magazines today.
But I think probably everyone else.
I think this is a context that we should also not forget for other artistic movements and this kind of rebellious gesture. It is the time of consumption, it is the time of new mass media, and every kind of rupture with the past is at the same time staged and real. As we saw, there is a kind of reconnecting to tradition in a different way, but there is a lot of staging. We should not forget the new media in this context and the consumption culture.
Yeah, I think that, so there's a lot of popular commentary and popular imagery of the new woman, and there's also already a right-wing backlash. There's people on the right, worrying about androgynous women and masculine women. And, artists were really fixated on the new woman as well, right? And thought of her as both representative of the time and, something that they needed to understand through this kind of critical realism. But also, the anxiety of male artists about changing gender roles is also belied by, this kind of fixation on the new woman. I think Schad is kind of interesting because his work doesn't seem to be as much of a caricature as a lot of, kind of well-known portraits like those by Dix at the time. And he claimed to really just be interested, be drawn to individuals and just, paint people he was fascinated by, but, and his portraits weren't commissioned, they were often from memory, so they're very strange and interesting, but he was really interested in kind of deviant sexualities and marginal figures. And,
yes, this is a very tame painting.
Yeah.
And it's also a great irony that here we are, 1928, Schad paints the new woman, his model is a Jew, and Schad goes on to join the Nazi Party. And which has, you were saying anxiety about this type of person. I mean, the Nazi ideology with women being the Hausfrau all over again after this is a pretty interesting development when he makes this. And I got to say that for the Neue Nationalgalerie, this is their Mona Lisa. This is the painting that people come to see most frequently. One thing that's hard to see, we skipped over Schlemmer a little bit, but there are actually two figures here. And so we have the one that looks like a robot that's very easy to see, and heading this way, but there's also a woman wearing very traditional clothing heading the other way. And so it's sort of a past and future changing of the guard in the image. So here are two women artists, and as you'll notice when you go through the exhibition, there are several women artists, but not as many as we might hope. And these two figures had very different positions in the art world at the time. So I don't know. Had any of you ever heard of Din Beat before this exhibition? I hadn't.
She is from my hometown.
Oh, really? Wow. This is the guy I need.
There was an exhibition of her work in Rostock.
But she had one exhibition. She was called Art Fremd, meaning alien to the species. A horrible thing to say about somebody. And so her career was basically squashed immediately by the right-wing press. And then Kollwitz here on the right. We had a colleague here in town recently who spoke in a part of Germany Berlin that used to be part of the East. And apparently, when you start talking about Kollwitz, everybody shudders because they get Kollwitz all the time in class, and she is so well known there. But I find her a tremendously important political artist for this era, and her whole way of presenting the result of militarism is so special. Otto Dix, at the same time that she was publishing her work portfolio, he publishes 50 images of what it's like in the trenches, and she publishes 7 images of the profound effect that going to war has on the people who are left behind.
So just going back to Dean Bitt for a second, so I didn't know about her work, but I think this is a really great portrait. I really, it's one of my favorite works in the show. I think it's, it kind of goes back to Renaissance portraiture again, but just trying to, there's not a lot written about her, but I did find that she did several portraits of herself, as obviously like a kind of an androgynous new woman. And she did several where she painted herself with her son. And I thought, this is extremely interesting because, there was this kind of right-wing questioning of masculine women, whether they could sort of function as mothers. And so she very much, tried to intervene in that debate and show herself as an artist, a mother, a modern woman. So I think her work was really interesting in that regard.
Oops.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm jumping. Which one would you like? You perked up on one right here.
No, I was going to just add to the Dean bit. I think it's really interesting, and it's hanging right beside Sonia, actually, or maybe one painting away. And I think they're really interesting contrasts because they're both images of the new woman. One is so glamorous, whereas the Kate Dean bit is very.
Who says Tilda Swinton isn't glamorous?
Well, there's a style. I would say there's a style, but if we also look at the fabrics, like the silk this transparent silk that Sonia is wearing compared to this heavier, more structured fabric, it's a really different image of the new woman, and I think also speaks to this question of the new woman as symbol versus the new woman as a historical person, and in this case, an artist representing herself in that identity.
Thank you. This is an interesting pair in that we have a husband and wife pair who are both very committed left-wing artists and who are very interested in the working class and even use the industrial spray paint technique for it to make their work, and I think that in this left-wing circle there is probably a greater opportunity for women. Does that ring true?
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that,
okay.
But I do think that many of the very compelling women artists from this period were involved in leftist politics. Käthe Kollwitz being a really galvanizing example for a later generation of young women artists coming of age in the Weimar Republic as well. What I do think, though, makes a difference is medium. Until the Weimar period, it was actually very difficult for women to get a conventional education in painting unless they were able to attend alternative schools, such as the one Käthe Kollwitz actually taught at. And Alice Lex-Nerlinger is interesting because her background is actually in photography and graphic design, which as trades were places where women could get an artistic education. So I think that's a difference too that should be kept in mind with works like these.
And I think the example of the Bauhaus is important here because so women were given, equal rights at the start of the Weimar Republic, and the Bauhaus is known for accepting, having a very large female student body who produced all of this really experimental work. But, it's also been shown that they were behind the scenes trying to limit, female enrollment, and they, Gropius and the other, male masters tried to push women into certain fields that were considered acceptable for women, like weaving. So it was really, kind of complicated. Yeah.
I can maybe add from theater that, and this is maybe very similar to some groups of painters, that this one kind of hallmark of avant-garde art was that artists didn't hide anymore, that they were actually creating art. You could see the traces of the creation process as part of what they created or produced. So they showed their means of production, and in this showing, which became a kind of technique in theater, also has taken on a very masculinist tone, because it was kind of a gesture of I show myself with my means of production and I produce something, and production was coded very masculinist, and if women succeeded, then it was there was masculine identity was almost the code for equality. I don't know, women became men, and as men they were equal, but this was kind of this became almost a norm, and part of it is this kind of productivist ethos that a lot of the avant-garde groups had, at least in theater. I can safely say this. I know less about groups of painters.
It's worth noting on that point that Käthe Kollwitz actually came under a lot of criticism from some of her socialist colleagues as well. There was a real question about the status of her work, whether it was political enough, if it was too melodramatic in its focus on grief. And the image that you had up on screen, the volunteers, I think this is probably, this is a great example because it's so much, it is still an expressionist work, we could say. Unusually for her, in the pre-war period, she was working in a more naturalist mode, and it was really the war that kind of pushed her to expressionism as a vehicle for her very strong pacifist politics. But we can see here this extreme force of emotion that's really pulling all the figures forward. In this case, this critique of this kind of rush to enlist. This is a painting called The Volunteers. And works like this were often attributed to her gender as an expression of her kind of feminine sentimentality amongst those circles.
And feminine sentimentality within these left circles was bourgeois. So in a way, if you wanted to become a progressive person, then you became a man. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little, but this was an underlying mode.
We've really gone way over our time. So I don't want to overdo it, but I think that we should probably address, at least to some degree, the dictatorship and art under such oppression. And I wondered if anybody, if these images are anything that anybody wants to address. This is an amazing story. If you haven't seen the exhibition, the painting on the left by Erwin Haas is not the first painting on the canvas. This is painted in 1944, but 1944 he had lost his position at an advanced art academy, but instead he wound up working in a German secondary school, a prep school essentially. And in April 1944, Hitler had his 55th birthday, and the school commissioned him to paint a portrait of Hitler for the occasion. And in the X-ray, you can see Hitler there. His mustache shows up very clearly on that halfway up that stretcher bar in the upper half of the image. You can see him standing there, and he was painted standing amid the very ruins that you see in the other painting. And that painting actually hung in an auditorium, not unlike this one, for several weeks until the police figured out what was going on. And the picture was removed. Amazingly, it went back to Haas, and he overpainted it with this incredible end of civilization picture we see here. But
yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think this room in the exhibition for me is one of the strongest because it's such a complex room, and each painting has it shows you the real range of ways that artists reacted to, survived, capitulated, resisted under this period. If you go back to the previous slide, and I mean the Kolbe slide. I'm not very knowledgeable about sculpture, so I won't say too much, but I'll just note, and those of you who visited the exhibition will read about this, but the dictatorship brought extreme changes to the art world. The landmark exhibition, the Degenerate Art Exhibition, laid out very firm guidelines for what counted as good German art and what counted as degenerate un-German art and a kind of pernicious influence. And of course, there were a lot of debates and disagreements within Nazi cultural policy, but to kind of tell a general picture, that this meant that artists needed to really carefully consider how they would position themselves in this new regime, which could change from year to year depending on who was in control of cultural policy at that moment. But Kolbe, and I think this is why this image is here, was kind of representing what we often think of as approved National Socialist art, which is this kind of classicizing depiction of a kind of idealized German body here. And Kolbe, you know, he was also a sculptor that was really a leading figure of the Weimar avant-garde. He was especially engaged in the body culture movement and the work of modern dancers, many of them women. Here we can see him, you know, creating work very similar to the work he was producing before, but finding a kind of niche that worked for him in this context versus...
I'll just interject. You were saying that this seems like an official... Actually, this was shown in the official German art exhibition. There was a series of exhibitions called the Great German Art Exhibition. And this was in the... They were held annually, starting in 1937, and this was in the 1941 or 42 edition of the exhibition. It was bought by Germany's foremost banker.
I just want to say something about the kind of conflict within the Nazi Party about what constitutes degenerate art, because this kind of course has to do with our topic, art and politics, and how difficult this is to look at an artwork and say, oh, this is left or right. There was an attempt within the Nazi Party to make German expressionism part of the German tradition, and Goebbels was, the propaganda minister, was an enormous admirer of Edvard Munch, for example, and he wrote him many letters. And Emil Nolde, and one of the expressionist artists, a Norwegian too, he was a kind of admirer of the Nazis. So there was an attempt to approximate a certain... Munch wasn't, but Nolde was, and this failed, the attempt to integrate expressionism within the Nazi canon, but it failed because of Hitler. I mean, if Goebbels had something to say about this, then it wouldn't have failed, and we probably would think about a lot of these paintings differently now.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to this point about the nationalism of expressionism as well in certain currents. So, yeah, if you wouldn't mind going back to the painters. Yeah, the Kretschmer, I think, is another really interesting example here. This is an extremely coded social allegory, and he's not a painter I know too much about, so Tom, maybe you could fill in, but you know, it's a relatively innocuous painting, we could say, but there's a very... But the
details get interesting because, for instance, right here is a copy of Mein Kampf, and then over here is a book by or about Mussolini, and then here we have the world that they're attempting to carve up right here.
Yeah.
So, and also, this is an era of Aryanization of Jewish businesses, and so you have these. We can think about why these people are painting the facade,
and this sense of a kind of putting on a new facade as well as something very symbolic, which many artists did to survive. So we can think of this as a way that another artist found to create a critical work kind of in disguise itself under the period.
Yeah, there are several in the exhibition where you look at them and you wouldn't know immediately why this is politically charged. There's a picture of a woman walking toward you, and it just looks like a Reginald Marsh painting of a woman going down the street in New York, but it's actually of a woman who gave her life working for the resistance. Whoops. I think we can, I think it's actually perhaps time to open this to questions and any reflections that anybody might have. I realize we've gone very long. If you feel like you need to leave, we're not offended. But we would like to take a few questions if we could and find out what people have on their minds. Yes, we have a mic for you right here.
Danke. I think about, is it Ronald Meyer? He's at Zurich talking about like AI generated art and modern fascism and the way this kind of, and we didn't really get to that period very much in this presentation, but the kind of return to this mean is something that a lot of kind of conservative art leans on in terms of, and you mentioned it a little bit with Neue Sachlichkeit, and I was just wondering about how those kinds of very standard, because this art is often looks not like that, like it's just not what I would expect. So kind of that contradiction, not contradiction necessarily, but like in my mind, making those two things make sense. Like I expect very regular, and this is not that.
Sorry, I think we didn't fully understand. Yeah, we lost track.
Willst du das sagen? Okay. Or I guess just or more specifically, the expressionism. We've talked a lot about the transitions between objectivity and expressionism, how that kind of like SparkNote's version carried forward with the art post-1933.
I think there was an extensive debate about expressionism in the 30s, which is really interesting, and I think maybe Matthias, you probably can speak about this. Yeah.
I can. This is one of the kind of fates of expressionism I can talk about. I mean, the kind of left socialist side, it was kind of totally dismissed and moved against under Stalin, and when the doctrine of socialist realism was developed, and of course it returned, I mean, within the kind of frame of socialist realism, because socialist realism is a very vague orientation, and if you look at socialist realist paintings, especially from East Germany, you see a lot of expressionists there, so that there is a kind of, it lived on despite the fact that it was so entirely kind of dismissed and considered bourgeois art under Stalin, and then in early East Germany, at least until the late 60s. Yeah.
And just, there was a debate, and I think it was mostly focused on expressionist literature, about how the irrationality of expressionism had sort of become, led to fascism, or had been like one component of fascism. And on the other hand, other thinkers tried to defend, that sort of the element in protest, the element of protest in expressionism, and
yeah.
So and I think it's
expressionism became a little the kind of poster child for all avant-garde movements. I mean, they moved against formalism. Formalism is not a movement, but the term formalism was used to devaluate all forms of avant-garde movement, and expressionism became kind of the example, poster child for what's wrong with bourgeois art and what has actually led to fascism, as you said. And this was in the context of the so-called Volksfrontpolitik, People's Front politic, when Stalin tried to unite everybody on a common platform, really everybody, against fascism, and art needed to be immediately comprehensible and should have a clear message, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these avant-garde movements just fell out of that. And that continued in East Germany and other socialist countries, this kind of politics, until the 60s, the 1960s.
Yes.
I was just curious as to, I know generally how a lot of the degenerate artists came to the US, but specifically, do you have more information about some of the details as to why we have so many here at the Art Institute?
I think that there are a couple of reasons. One is that Richard Davis, known as Dickie Davis, our former director, and was very, very interested in modern art movements, and he was a swashbuckling buyer and seller of art. He radically transformed Mia's collections, and he inspired many collectors here in town, advising them as well. And so I think that he was helping to create the demand for this art in the community, and the community responded and eventually gave the works, or sometimes gave them right away. So I think a lot of the credit needs to go to Davis. There's also a huge German community here not just here, but in the entire Midwest. I mean, if you want to look for great German expressionist collections, come to the Midwest. For instance, St. Louis has the largest collection of Max Beckmann paintings, because Max Beckmann, when he came to America, went to St. Louis at the behest of their director, Perry Rathbone. And so he taught at Washington University there for a couple of years before moving to New York, and he died shortly thereafter. But he wound up inspiring, as particularly one collector there, Morton May, who bought a lot of the work. And so there were people who responded to this work here in the Midwest. And one reason also is that in Midwest, collecting was a little newer than it was in the East, and there was more openness to new movements, and there was very, very much interest in it, and so we are the beneficiaries of that. As a result, we have a very fine Curator collection, a little heavy on the late work. I wish we could have kept the ones that are in the exhibition, but that's really the genesis of it, and it's still paying off. I mean, even as recently as 2 years ago, we acquired 3 German Expressionist pictures, and 2 by gift and one by purchase, but from a local collection. And so it really is remarkable how long that legacy has endured. Any more questions? Well, oh, yes, sir.
Yes, I'm wondering, of all the movements that was going on beginning of the century, psychoanalysis or psychology or Freud or Jung's impact on the society, I wonder, has there been any discussions in art circles about the effect of psychology or psychoanalysis reinterpreting a lot of these paintings?
Yes.
No, quite a bit. And I mean, many of the artists themselves were very interested in Freud's work as well. So it's not just a question of scholars today making this connection, but the artists themselves were very interested in exploring ideas of the unconscious, as well as different mechanisms of repression, which I think is something that really helps us think about Neue Sachlichkeit as well. So that's just a short response. But.
It's just that I never hear people talk about it, and it seems so obvious.
Yeah, and there was surrealism after all, which was entirely inspired by Freud, but other movements as well. And yeah.
I think the reason people may not talk about it is that the literature is so voluminous that nobody can really digest it all. Any more questions? Well, I want to thank you for being here. I especially want to thank our panelists. You're so kind to be with us today. I think that we've all learned a lot. And I hope it will prompt you to go up and have another look at the exhibition. And I am so grateful for you all sharing your time, sharing this beautiful day with us inside. And I just want to say that I find this a very important exhibition in Minnesota in our time, because I think there's so much resonance, and I hope that you will also invite your friends to come to the exhibition. I think that it's quite a rewarding experience. Did anybody have any more remarks, or should we close it out?
Just wanted to, thank you for having us, and thank you for coming.
Thanks all around. And again, thanks to Virajta for getting the whole ball rolling. And once again, especially, thank you for your support of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, because without your support, none of this happens. Thank you.